Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's conversation series. The Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is being given an award for his sanitation and toilet access initiative called the Clean India Mission at the Gates Foundation's annual Goalkeeper event in New York City on September 24th and 25th. Since the award was announced, many, including myself, writers, scholars, civil society activists have all raised serious concerns about this award. But despite these concerns, the Gates Foundation has gone ahead and will continue to give this award to Narendra Modi. But in all of this conversation, what has been truly missing is the critique of Gates Foundation itself and Gates Foundation and other Philanthro-capitalists and their work in countries like India and Sub-Saharan Africa. So joining us today is Dr. Kalpana Wilson, who is a lecturer in the Department of Geography at the Birkbeck University of London. Her research explores questions of race, gender, labor, neoliberalism, reproductive rights, and justice. And she's written extensively about the contemporary population policies globally and in South Asia. She's the author of Race, Racism, and Development, Interrogating History, Discourse, and Practice. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Suchitra.
Dr. Wilson, I just wanted to start with the basics. In your work, you talk about Hindu fascism and its entrenched relationship to neoliberal capitalism. Can you tell us what this means and lay down the basics about foundations like the Gates and what they do?
Okay, well, starting off with this term Hindu fascism, perhaps it would be better termed as Hindutva fascism, because as we know, Hindutva is the key ideology which inspires all of these Hindu far-right organizations. But we call it fascism for some very specific reasons. One of them is, of course, that if we look at its history, we can see that the core organization of this whole network of Hindu right-wing groups, the RSS, was founded in the 1920s, and it was actually explicitly modeled on Mussolini's black shirts, right? So the Italian fascists. And then you have the writings of people like M.S. Golwalkar, who is one of the most revered Hindutva ideologues, who was really extremely lavish in his praise of Hitler's Nazi Germany. He called Nazi Germany a model of race pride in its treatment of the Jews, and said it was something which India should emulate. So those links are very clear, and they've continued. Hitler is still highly admired among the Hindu fascists. Under Modi, textbooks in Gujarat, for example, praise him as a great leader. But in terms of this relationship with neoliberalism, which I try to kind of highlight particularly in my work, of course, the RSS and other Hindu right organizations and the BJP have always been pro-capitalist, and in fact, right from the outset, you see them identify communists as one of their most hated enemies. But for a long time, for many decades, they were kind of seen as representing the interests of small business, of small shopkeepers and so on, because these were their main supporters at that time. But then from the 1990s onwards, you see a change where basically you get the development of this kind of hyper-nationalism, which specifically focuses on this idea of untrammeled growth and based on basically untrammeled profits for corporates. And what goes with that, as we know, is extreme increases in inequality, in poverty, and so on. But this is a model which is increasingly being really celebrated, and particularly, of course, in the diaspora. So the kind of hyper-nationalism, we saw exhibited at the Howdy Modi event and so on, it very much sort of represents this kind of a model of Indian nationalism. And of course, we have to remember there's no element of economic nationalism in this, because a lot of the corporates who are making these huge profits are actually foreign companies. So there's no problem within the Hindutva ideology There's no problem with India getting plundered by foreign corporates. The nationalism is very much defined in relation to certain specific enemies as they're perceived. So Pakistan, and of course the minority communities within India. And then in practice, you see, from particularly in the 2000s when Narendra Modi became Chief Minister of Gujarat, you see this being put into practice with, huge swathes of land being, taken over for special economic zones, people being displaced on a massive scale, the kind of complete ignoring or even abolishing of labor laws and so on. And this then got, of course, a very good response from the corporates, and they started, referring to him as India's CEO in waiting, this kind of thing, and coming together at events like Vibrant Gujarat and saying that this is the person we want to be the next Prime Minister of India. And, this very, very close relationship with the corporates has continued. So if you look at even what's happened in Kashmir recently with the abrogation of Article 370 and Article 35A, a very important aspect of it is that people from outside Kashmir can now buy land in Kashmir. And as soon as the announcement was made, you got Ambani and Reliance Industries kind of rolling out their program for going into Kashmir and for basically plundering Kashmir. So, this whole agenda is very much part of what's happening there in Kashmir. But just because we're going to be talking about the Gates Foundation, I wanted to talk about the other side of neoliberalism, because on the one hand you get this what we're very familiar with, corporates taking over land, mining companies coming in and displacing people, land being taken over for real estate, and all of these things are happening on a very big scale. But the other side of it is the kind of making the poor responsible for their own poverty. So the kinds of social programs which you see under neoliberalism, and which are now being promoted, for example, by the World Bank, are all about basically blaming the victim in a sense, and saying that if only we can change the way people behave, then they will not be so poor. They will not be suffering from these effects of global capitalism. And in a way, the Swachh Bharat campaign, which you mentioned, the Clean India campaign, which Modi is getting this award for, is a very good example of this. A lot of Dalit activists have talked about how it doesn't in any way address the whole question of so-called manual scavenging, where overwhelmingly Dalits are compelled to clean sewers and septic tanks in incredibly dangerous conditions, where you've had a huge number of deaths, over 400 just in Delhi alone in the last 2 years. People have been killed doing this. And Clean India doesn't talk about this at all. In fact, Modi has been he's gone on record saying that it's actually a spiritual calling to do this kind of work. Really kind of demonstrating how embedded caste supremacy is within his whole approach. But also the other aspect of it is that so much of Clean India, Swachh Bharat, has been about shaming people who are forced into, defecating in the open because of the lack of toilets. So that was a huge part of the campaign. And interestingly, we can look at one of the cases of mob lynching, actually, which really demonstrates some of these connections. It's, as there's been this tremendous real epidemic of lynchings of Muslims in particular, as well as Dalits, very much supported by the state and carried out by Hindu right groups. But this particular case I want to briefly talk about is of a left activist. He belonged to the CPI-ML, Rajasthan, and he's called Zafar Hussain. And he was basically found that the officials of the Swachh Bharat campaign were going to a particular area and they were harassing women who were, going to relieve themselves in the fields because they didn't have toilets. And they were taking photographs of them, videoing them, and generally kind of trying to shame them. And then when Zafar Hussain intervened and tried to stop this from happening, he was brutally attacked by the workers of Swachh Bharat in a way which was obviously also about his being a Muslim, and he was beaten to death. So these kinds of cases really show the sort of the connections between Hindutva and a particular kind of neoliberal model which we're now seeing, I think, in India.
I just quickly wanted to also talk about Philanthro-capitalism and how foundations like the Gates Foundation, which is one of the richest foundations in the world, now operate with no transparency and without any oversight. Can you tell us how this climate of impunity was created and how it enables the corporate plunder of India on other places, even like in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world?
Well, I mean, the Gates Foundation, as you said, is now tremendously powerful. I mean, for example, in the field of global health, it basically completely sets the agenda because it's donating more than any other foundation, but also than any other country in the world. So it's really, the major actor. And because it puts so much money into research and also into the media, it is very difficult to criticize it. So there's a kind of silencing effect because of the fact that so much of the research which is going on is actually funded by the Gates Foundation. And so people are afraid to actually openly criticize it. And also, as I said, a lot of major media outlets are also partially now funded by the Gates Foundation. So, for example, the Guardian newspaper in the UK, its whole global development section is funded by Gates, and as a result, it's extremely reluctant to publish anything which could even mildly be construed as criticism of Gates. So there's a real lack of accountability. And the other thing which I think we should bear in mind when we think about Gates is that how is its money, the Gates Foundation's money is generated, partly, of course, through the huge profits of Microsoft and the huge scale of tax evasion as well by Microsoft, but also by its investment in the very industries which cause the problems which Gates then claims to be trying to address. So there's huge they talk a lot about climate change, but they hugely invest in fossil fuels, in extractive industries, also in pharmaceutical companies, which really calls into question their policies which claim to be about women's reproductive rights. And I think we're going to go on to talk about that a little more. But basically, this is what happens when you have you have a global climate of neoliberalism and austerity, where state spending across the world has been massively cut, and then you have corporations like this coming in, which are not in any way elected, which have huge amounts of funds, and which are completely unaccountable. And this is some of the research which I've been doing around their work, as I said, on reproductive rights and family planning. And I've also written with my colleague Amanda Shaw about their work on climate smart agriculture, which works in a very similar way.
And previously, you wrote that a key aspect of the Gates-Modi synergy is Gates' commitment to population policies, which project the fertility of women in the global south as the cause for crisis of capitalism has generated, from poverty to climate change to conflict. Can you break this down for us, and also placing this in the larger history, as you rightly said, criminalizing people for their own poverty, and also somehow claiming that it is the population explosion among the world's poorest, mostly brown and black women, that's a reason for the crisis of capitalism?
Well, I mean, of course, this again has quite a long history, because if you look at the whole period of the Cold War, so sort of from the 1950s onwards, right up till the 1990s, you had this idea being promoted by the US and by international organizations like the World Bank that, as you said, it was black and brown women having too many children, which really made them poor. And so this had to be controlled. And beyond this, there was this idea that this poverty then was the cause of communism. So it was very much a kind of geopolitical imperative. And so in this whole phase, you had huge amounts of funds being given to countries in the global south on condition that they met certain targets in reducing fertility rates and birth rates. And then you had, of course, a lot of women's movements in the global south, in South Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America, kind of challenging this and organizing against the kind of abuses which came out of this. And then one of the things which was kind of established, there was the International Conference on Population Development in Cairo in 1994, was that when you have targets, you inevitably have coercion, you inevitably have abuses, you have forced sterilizations, you have women being put onto dangerous contraceptives without their consent being sought. And there was, extensive evidence of this. And so there was a kind of, recognition that targets were generally a bad thing. But what you've got now really is the return of targets in a big way. The Gates Foundation has been very, very central to this, because they have been the key player in setting up the FP 2020 initiative, which seeks to get 120 million women onto voluntary contraception by 2020. Of course, they haven't met that target, and now the whole thing is being extended and renamed as FP 2030. But within this, you have basically a return of targets in new forms. So in India, they no longer talk about targets, but they talk about expected levels of achievement, which is just really a euphemism for targets, right? Which are then set, at the state level, and then they're passed on to health workers who are under tremendous pressure to achieve them. And that's when you get, women being forced into sterilization camps and so on. And of course, these camps are also now run by private doctors who are given, massive incentives to basically get the numbers done. So these then take place under extremely dangerous conditions, very extremely insanitary conditions, and you have women dying, which is what happened in Chhattisgarh when 15 women died in a sterilization camp in 2014. And of course, the other aspect of this is that Gates is also very much involved in the promotion of long-acting hormonal contraceptives. Recently, India has agreed, after a very long time, to include Depo-Provera in its national family planning programs. And Depo-Provera is a drug which has been, for a very long time, experts in sexual and reproductive health and rights, and feminist activists in these areas have been, extremely critical of the use of Depo-Provera because of the fact that it has very serious side effects. It's known to lead to things like osteoporosis. There's also still a big question hanging over its relationship to HIV acquisition and transmission, and so there's a great deal of opposition to it. And in a way, the biggest problem is that it is not designed to be used by women in a situation where there is basically not a proper healthcare system in place. It needs follow-up, it needs the support of doctors. Women will have side effects, and some of them can be dangerous to their health. But it's being promoted precisely in those contexts where healthcare has been completely eviscerated and is, in a very bad state, as is the case in India, because under Modi, the existing quite inadequate healthcare system has really been completely undermined, as a report last year, when a number of healthcare experts and doctors published a report in The Lancet, showed, where they actually expressed their deep concern about what's happening to health under Modi.
And I just wanted to, I know you already mentioned the global FP 2020 initiative. I was wondering if you could explain what the FP 2020, soon to be, as you rightly said, the FP 2030 initiative, how the Gates Foundation is involved in this, how it targets women in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Can you break it down for those who have never heard about what this initiative is and things that they should be cognizant of?
Well, I think the thing, as I said, FP 2020 is really very much geared to promoting, what they call family planning. It stands for Family Planning 2020. And in particular, it is these three long-acting hormonal contraceptives. So Depo-Provera, which is manufactured by Pfizer, Jadel, which is manufactured by Bayer, and Implanon, which is an implant manufactured by Merck. And basically, all these three big pharmaceutical corporations are given what are called volume guarantees, where basically aid donors promise to, to kind of sell a certain number of these, and as a result, these corporations offer them at lower prices. So once again, you have targets coming in, and as I said, once you have targets in place, there's bound to be an element of coercion. Coming back to what we talked about earlier in terms of the relationship with Hindu fascist politics, I think that in any case you have a situation in India where those who have always been seen as those who are supposedly having too many children are the poor, are Dalit women, Adivasi women, and they are the ones who are targeted for these policies. But currently you have a situation where this is really intensified, and where you have a constant kind of discourse of fear and kind of fear-mongering and hate-mongering around this question of numbers. And particularly, of course, this focuses on Muslims. So, population is something which is constantly being mentioned by the ruling party, by elected politicians. Every other day you will hear of a BJP politician making a speech saying we need a law to control Muslim population growth, or saying that Hindu women should be having at least 4 children because our community is under threat. Now, of course, these are built on completely false figures, because in fact the latest census information shows that the population growth rate among Muslim communities is actually falling faster than any other community in India. So there's no question of it having any kind of basis in reality. This is the kind of fear-mongering which we also see in the West around, white supremacy. This idea of people being outnumbered is constantly invoked. And this is also linked to then this idea that demonized minority communities are somehow over-fertile, comes to be linked to the tremendous violence which is unleashed on women of these communities. We saw this in Gujarat in 2002, where the rapists, those inciting rape, were kind of constantly talking about preventing more Muslims from being born and those kinds of things. So this is the other side, in a way, of these policies around population, which are presented as not only benign, but they're presented as actually being about women's reproductive rights, because they're saying, oh well, women will be given choices and so on. But I think one of the things which feminists working on sexual and reproductive health and rights have emphasized is that women having real choices, women having control over their bodies, is simply incompatible with a situation where you're talking about targets and numbers and about particular groups of people being compelled to reproduce less. And that's why it's extremely dangerous.
I just have a quick follow-up question. Does the Gates Foundation have any direct investments in 3 of the companies that you mentioned that also produce the injectables and the implantable hormonal contraceptives? Do we have information about that? Is there any data?
I mean, there's certainly data about its investment in pharmaceutical corporations, and this in a way links not only to the production of contraceptives, but also, to its whole involvement in other forms of chemical industries, which again, as I said, are linked to all kinds of health issues, which it then claims to be trying to address, so around reproductive health and so on. So there is, more research needs to be done. As I said, it is in fact not only very secretive, but it's quite very obstructive in terms of researchers. And one of the reasons that this research more needs to be done is precisely because it's so difficult to hold the Gates Foundation accountable. But certainly there are very close relationships between the Gates Foundation and these companies. And as I said, they are actually giving them guarantees and so on that certain amounts of sales will take place. So it's a very close relationship. And very often, these drugs which are being then promoted in the global south are actually ones which have been rejected in the global north. So if you look at the case of Implanon, for example, the first generation of Implanon, there were a lot of complaints in Britain, for example, about it because it was getting lost in the body and it couldn't be seen by X-ray. So then they developed a new generation, which is called Nexplanon, which is actually the same, has a lot of the same problems, but you can actually see it in the body through an X-ray. And then you found that, the company was obviously left with huge stocks of Implanon. So these were then incorporated into a scheme to promote this in Ethiopia and several other of the lowest income countries. So it is literally, the dumping of contraceptives which are known to be inadequate or dangerous. And the other thing I think we need to think about is that one of the reasons why Gates has become so very preeminent in the field of contraception and family planning is because of the current policy under Trump. where because of his extension of the what's called the global gag rule, where any organization which can be seen to have any kind of, however tenuous, connection with providing abortion services will not be funded by aid from the US. So that has left a huge gap to be filled. And that's why the Gates Foundation is particularly significant, and we really need to think about what it's doing at the moment in this field. But also, one of the things which is perhaps less known is that Gates themselves, and Melinda Gates in particular, are themselves opposed to abortion, actually. And so what this means is that they are very keen on promoting contraceptives like long-acting hormonal contraceptives, which are like the most effective in preventing pregnancy, because they believe that that will then reduce abortions. But the question we have to ask is, do we want to promote that level of effectiveness at the cost of women's health when we have these very serious side effects and dangers associated with them? And is this really the only concern, to have something which is like supposed to be 99.75% effective, as opposed to other contraceptives which are, maybe 1 or 2 percentage points less effective?
You also speak about this idea of how India's population policies are gender violence onto themselves. Can you break that down, this idea of existing public policy being an act of gender violence? Because often public policy is seen as neutral, it's seen as benign, often not associated with any particular ideology. So can you break that down for us?
Well, I mean, I think, when you look at the state, implementing public policy, then you need to look at what kinds of power relations that state represents. And for if you look, for example, at the state of Chhattisgarh, where, as I mentioned, you had this sterilization camp in 2014, where many women actually died as a result of botched sterilizations and as a result of infection. When you look at the women who died, they were mainly either Dalits or Adivasis or from what's called other backward classes, and they were all from very low-income households. So their experience of the state, in any case, has always been one of violence of various kinds. This is a state where you're seeing, as I said, the sort of the takeover of land on a huge scale, people being dispossessed, people being driven into highly militarized zones where they are basically surrounded in what are essentially camps. And then, you have this huge militarization, you have a lot of, acute violence by police and paramilitaries, you have experiences of rape by the police. So these are the only ways which people a lot of the time experience the state. And then you have a drive like this coming in, where women, they don't have regular health care, they don't have access to clinics, and suddenly health workers will arrive and start basically telling them that they must get sterilized. And even in cases, and there are many cases, of course, where women themselves, are very much want to access effective contraception which they can control, but then they find that the only things which are on offer are either sterilization under these kinds of conditions very often, or contraceptives which essentially are quite likely to make them ill and which they have very little control over. Like the injections and the implants. So this is the kind of context where we can talk about these family planning initiatives as fitting into a wider context of gendered violence. And I think, this is it's not just in one place or one state. This is a much wider question, really, about the kind of the gendered violence of the state. And it's something which, in the context of Hindutva, has been really, really intensified because, as I said, the targeting of women's bodies, particularly women who belong to minority communities, particularly Dalit women, Adivasi women, is absolutely central to the way the Hindutva ideology works. There's this idea that Hindu upper caste men have been somehow emasculated, and they have to prove their masculinity through these acts of extreme violence, often sexual violence. And in response to myths like the myth of love jihad and so on, this idea that Muslim men are somehow out to seduce and convert Hindu women. And of course, there's a lot of parallels with the ideologies around white supremacy and so on, and the kind of things which Trump mobilizes in the US at the moment.
And I was just wondering, would it be right to make a historical comparison between the forced sterilizations that happened during Indira Gandhi's emergency in India and the kind of gendered policies that are now being put into play by the Modi government?
I mean, I think that's a very, very interesting question because, of course, the emergency was a very, very, very disturbing chapter in India's history. From 1975 to 77, you had this complete suspension of civil liberties, press freedom, and so on. And a lot of people are saying that what we're having at the moment in India is an undeclared emergency. So without ever declaring that this is anything out of the ordinary, it has actually become normalized to have, the kind of takeover of the media in various ways. The suppression of any critical voices, arrests of people who dissent, assassinations of people who dare to critique the government. So all of these things are going on. And when we look at what happened around the mass sterilizations, it's quite interesting because during the emergency, what really led to mass protests and played a big role in the downfall of Indira Gandhi's government was the mass vasectomies program, so aimed at men, where men were the ones being herded into camps and forcibly sterilized. And this is quite an unusual kind of chapter, really, in the history of sterilization, because it targeted men. And that was one of the reasons, I think, for this sort of, really massive kind of opposition to it. And after that, family planning policy has concentrated overwhelmingly on sterilizing women, and there hasn't been the same degree of opposition to it. Of course, women's movements have been vocal around it, and progressive and left movements have, but it hasn't generated the same degree of massive opposition. And I think now you've got a situation where it is, as I said, being kind of normalized, so that it is not a situation of kind of these are some special measures which are being taken. This is a kind of just as there's this undeclared emergency in other ways, you're having all of these things going on, and women are dying regularly through forcible sterilization. Of course, recently there have been there has been a judgment of the Supreme Court, and there has been a claim that they will be phased out. But as long as the Indian government is signed up to these globally set targets, it's going to be very difficult to avoid reliance on sterilization camps in particular. And when you have sterilization camps, you can't avoid elements of coercion and elements of extreme malpractice really coming in.
And as we come to the end of this conversation, I was wondering if there are ideas, suggestions, and strategies that we can take to those in communities resisting these actions, but also perhaps ways in which we can mainstream and platform these important, crucial ideas around policies and gendered violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, as I said, a lot of, organizations on the ground and campaigns going on. So I would really encourage people to find out more about that. And, they do have a presence on the internet. And so it's possible to find out and to kind of publicize and, share that kind of information, especially right now when there's so much publicity around Gates giving this award to Modi. But also, I think just to think a bit more about what it means when organizations like Gates talk about reproductive rights and choice and empowerment. And the way those ideas have been kind of used to put forward a particular model, which really involves a lot of violence and a lot of reinforcing of inequalities, really. So I think that's important. I think that the other thing on a broader scale, which comes to mind at this moment, is just that it's really important to counter this idea that Modi really represents the Indian diaspora, and that the Indian diaspora is some kind of monolithic, group of kind of rabid Modi supporters and Hindutva supporters. So, if you don't agree with some of the things that we've talked about, or, some of the information which you're getting about what's happening in India, then, you should really make your voice heard, reach out to the organizations which are organizing protests right now, which are active in kind of actually saying that we are also the diaspora, and this is not being done in our name.
Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for joining us. As a part of our conversation series, we will be having more conversation around Hindutva, fascism, neoliberalism, reproductive justice, and rights.